That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
There is a moment in the history of American television so strange, so quietly scandalous, that most people have never heard of it. A single episode of one of the most celebrated shows ever made was broadcast once, on a single spring evening in 1964, and then it disappeared. Not because the tape was damaged. Not because the network lost the rights. It vanished because the people in charge decided that what they had put on screen was simply too much for the country to handle. For more than half a century, that episode existed only as a rumor, a bootleg, a ghost story passed between fans who could barely describe what they had seen. And then one day it came back. This is the story of that episode, of the man who created it, and of why the questions it was asking in 1964 have never really gone away. To understand what happened, you have to understand what the Twilight Zone was, and more importantly, what it was trying to do. When Rod Serling launched the series on CBS in October of 1959, American television was not a place built for difficult conversations. It was a medium built for comfort. Sponsors wanted pleasant audiences. Networks wanted happy advertisers. Viewers were expected to be entertained, occasionally moved, but never genuinely disturbed. Serling had spent years trying to write serious drama for live television, and he had been frustrated at every turn by a system that softened his sharpest work before it ever reached an audience. His scripts about racism and injustice were rewritten by network executives afraid of losing sponsors in the South. Stories that named real social wounds were sanded down until the wounds disappeared entirely. Serling was talented enough to get his work on the air, but the work that arrived was rarely the work he had written. The Twilight Zone was his solution to that problem. If you could not say that a small town in Mississippi was gripped by racial terror, perhaps you could say that a small town somewhere in the middle of nowhere had been taken over by something inexplicable, something monstrous, something that looked almost human, but was driven by ancient, irrational hatred. If you could not put a story about nuclear anxiety and suburban selfishness directly in front of an audience, perhaps you could wrap it in a fallout shelter, in a countdown, in a science fiction premise that let the audience pretend, just for a moment, that they were watching something imaginary. The genre was a disguise. Serling wore it brilliantly. He understood that the distance created by fantasy could, paradoxically, bring an audience closer to truths they would otherwise flinch from. Put something far enough away, make it strange enough, and suddenly people could look directly at it without blinking. It worked for a while. The show ran for 5 seasons and produced 156 episodes. Among them were some of the most penetrating pieces of social criticism ever broadcast on American television, packaged as stories about robots and time machines and alien invasions. Serling wrote or co-wrote the majority of them himself, narrating each one in that precise, slightly ominous voice that became one of the most recognizable sounds in American culture. He was exhausted by the end of it. The constant battles with sponsors, with network censors, with executives who wanted him to smooth down his edges, had worn him down considerably. But he kept writing, kept pushing, kept finding the edges of what the medium would allow. And in the 5th and final season of the original series, he pushed past those edges entirely with a single episode that would haunt the show's legacy for decades. The episode was called The Encounter. It aired on May 1, 1964. It starred Neville Brand as a World War II veteran named Fenton and a young actor named George Takei, years before his career-defining role on Star Trek, as a Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori. The entire episode unfolds in a single location, an attic, over what feels like a single continuous afternoon. There are no special effects. There is no monster. There is no alien intelligence sending coded signals from beyond the stars. There are only 2 men, a cluttered room, and a Japanese samurai sword that one of them took from a soldier he killed on a Pacific island 20 years before. What happens between Fenton and Arthur in that attic is not easily summarized. The story begins simply enough. Arthur shows up looking for odd jobs. Fenton, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings, lets him in. They share a drink. They talk about the war. And then very gradually, the walls between them begin to dissolve in the least comfortable way possible. Fenton begins to revisit things he has never quite buried. The killing, the sword, the question of whether what he did in the Pacific was heroism or murder, or something in between that American mythology had never given him a word for. Arthur, meanwhile, is carrying his own weight. He grew up in the United States as a Japanese American, which means he grew up in a country that, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, decided that people who looked like him could not be trusted. He and more than 100,000 others were removed from their homes and placed in internment camps, held without charges, their loyalty simply assumed to be absent because of their ancestry. He knows what it means to be looked at and found guilty before a single fact has been examined. Sorling built the episode as a slow, deliberate pressure cooker. The two men circle each other, each one trying to maintain the surface of a normal, polite interaction, each one failing more completely as the minutes pass. Old resentments leak through. Fenton's nostalgia for the war curdles into something uglier when directed, young Japanese-American man sitting across from him. Arthur's patience frays as he realizes that Fenton is not really talking to him at all, but to some idea of him, some projection built from wartime propaganda and unexamined fear. And then the episode takes a turn that guaranteed its eventual disappearance from television history. Arthur says something that no one had expected. He tells Fenton that his father was a spy, that his father had passed information to Imperial Japan, that his father, in some sense, had contributed to Pearl Harbor. The moment lands like a grenade. Sorling was not making a factual claim about Japanese Americans. He was doing something far more psychologically complicated. He was writing about the way that guilt, when it has no place to go, turns inward. He was writing about what it means to grow up as the child of a people who were collectively accused of treachery and never fully exonerated. Arthur's confession is not presented as simple truth. It arrives wrapped in ambiguity, in the strange pressure of the room, in the way the sword seems to pull both men towards something they cannot quite name. Whether Arthur is telling a literal truth about his father, or performing a kind of dark theater in which he enacts the accusation that his whole community has spent decades trying to refute, is left entirely open. Sorling trusted his audience to sit with that ambiguity. CBS, it turned out, did not share that trust. The complaints came quickly. Viewer mail described the episode as offensive, inflammatory, dangerous. Japanese-American community organizations were particularly vocal. They objected to the portrayal of Arthur's father as a collaborator with Imperial Japan, seeing it as a validation of exactly the paranoid logic that had justified the internment camps. From their perspective, the episode took the most painful wound in their collective history, the accusation of disloyalty used to strip them of their homes and their freedom, and placed it in the mouth of a Japanese-American character who then confirmed it as true. CBS executives, already nervous about the show's declining ratings and the increasing restlessness of their sponsors, did not defend the episode. They did not engage with its complexity or argue for the importance of uncomfortable drama. They simply removed it. When the Twilight Zone entered syndication, the encounter was not included. When cable networks ran marathons of the series, the encounter was missing. When home video releases compiled the full run of the show, the encounter was skipped. For the better part of 5 decades, it existed outside the official record of the series, known only to those who had seen it on that single broadcast night or managed to track down one of the rare bootleg copies that circulated among dedicated collectors. What makes this story more than a simple footnote in television history is everything it reveals about the mechanics of cultural memory, about which stories get told and which ones get quietly retired. Rod Serling made a show that was specifically, deliberately designed to say things that could not otherwise be said in American broadcasting. The entire premise of The Twilight Zone was built on the insight that certain truths require a particular kind of camouflage to survive the journey from writer to audience. Serling had won that battle repeatedly, across 5 seasons and more than 100 episodes. And then, in the case of the encounter, the camouflage was not enough. The episode was too direct, too unresolved, too willing to leave its audience in genuine discomfort rather than escorting them safely through to a moral conclusion. Television, even Twilight Zone television, had its limits. The encounter had found them. George Takei, who played Arthur, carried the episode's history in a particularly intimate way. He had been a child when the government came for his family. He was 5 years old when soldiers arrived at his home in Los Angeles, and his family was taken to the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas. He grew up understanding from the inside what it meant to be the enemy in your own country, to have your nationality treated as something provisional, something that could be revoked at any moment by the calculations of men who had never met you. When he took the role of Arthur Takamori, he was not playing a fictional character so much as he was inhabiting a version of his own experience, filtered through Serling's imagination. His performance in the episode is quiet and deeply unsettling, not because Arthur is villainous or simple, but because he is carrying something enormous and has nowhere to put it down. Takei went on to become one of the most prominent voices in American public life for the preservation of Japanese-American internment history. He advocated tirelessly for recognition of what the government had done, for education, for memorialization, for the simple acknowledgement that the camps had existed, and that what happened inside them was a profound violation of the principles the country claimed to hold. He also, in his later years, became increasingly open about the encounter, about what it meant to him, about the complexity of a performance that required him to speak lines that, in a certain light, seemed to condemn the very community he was fighting to protect. He understood, as Sorling had understood, that the episode was not making an argument about Japanese-American disloyalty. It was making an argument about the impossible psychic position of people who have been accused of something they did not do, and then told for the rest of their lives that the accusation is behind them now, that they should move forward, that the wound is healed. Arthur's confession, in Takei's interpretation, is not an admission of guilt, is a cry of exhaustion. It is what happens when someone has been told for long enough that they are suspicious, that they are dangerous, that their loyalty is always in question, that they finally collapse under the weight of the allegation and make it their own. The episode was finally brought back into circulation in 2016, when a cable channel acquired the rights to air a full Twilight Zone marathon and made the decision to include the encounter in its entirety for the first time since its original broadcast. The response was striking. Viewers who had known about the episode only through rumors and second-hand descriptions were confronted with the actual thing. And what they found was not the crude racial provocation they might have expected from something that had been treated as too dangerous to show. They found a piece of drama that was genuinely difficult, genuinely uncomfortable, and genuinely serious about the questions it was raising. The discomfort did not come from carelessness. It came from a writer who refused to resolve a contradiction that was not actually resolved in the world outside the television set. The contradictions Sorling was wrestling with in 1964 have not resolved themselves in the years since. The internment of Japanese Americans received a formal government apology in 1988, nearly a quarter century after the encounter aired, when the Civil Liberties Act acknowledged that the policy had been driven by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria rather than any genuine security concern. The apology was meaningful, but apologies do not undo history. They do not restore what was taken. They do not prevent the same logic from being applied to a different group in a different moment of national fear. The question that Sorling embedded in the encounter, which is the question of how a society deals with the psychological aftermath of collective injustice, remained as alive in 1988 as it had been in 1964, and it remains alive today. The years following 2020 in particular brought a wave of anti-Asian violence across the United States that echoed, in a deeply uncomfortable way, the paranoia that had made the internment camps possible. Asian Americans were blamed, harassed, and attacked in public spaces. People who had been born in the United States, who had lived there for generations, who were in every meaningful sense American, found themselves suddenly marked as foreign, as suspect, as somehow responsible for a crisis that had nothing to do with them. The dynamic was not new. It was, in fact, one of the oldest dynamics in American life. The enemy becomes a face. The face becomes a category. The category becomes a justification. Sorling had drawn that dynamic in a single attic with 2 actors and stolen sword, and he had drawn it so accurately that it had to be hidden for 55 years before anyone was ready to look at it directly. The encounter belongs to a tradition in American storytelling that is both celebrated and perpetually under pressure, the tradition of art that refuses to make things easier than they are. Rod Sorling built his career on the conviction that the most important function of drama was not to comfort the audience, but to disturb them in productive ways, to force them into positions from which the world looked different than it had before. He understood that this was a dangerous thing to do, that the industry he worked in was not fundamentally structured to support it, and he did it anyway, using whatever formal and commercial cover the genre of speculative fiction could provide. When that cover was stripped away, when the encounter made its accusations and its confessions too directly and too ambiguously for the network to manage, the network simply made the episode disappear. That it has come back, that it is now available to be watched and argued about and found uncomfortable for the right reasons, matters in a way that goes beyond the history of a single television show. The return of the encounter is a reminder that the stories a culture suppresses are often the stories it most needs to hear. Censorship, even when it presents itself as a protective act, even when it is motivated by genuine concern about harm, has a cost. The cost is the conversation that does not happen. The cost is the generation of viewers who never had to sit with the question of what it means to carry an accusation inside you that was never really yours to carry. The cost is the comfortable fiction that some moons are behind us when they're still, in fact, right in front of us, waiting to be acknowledged. Rod Serling died in 1975, years before the government apology, years before the revival.